in how those states function. And the question we're going to ask today, and each panelist will address it in a different part of the region, is how can we leverage what we're doing in that realm to better help religious freedom? Very excited to have these four gentlemen on the panel. In addition to being friends of mine, they're partners of the Philos Project, and certainly partners of In Defense of Christians. I'm going to introduce them and then just pass the floor to them. First up will be Samuel Tadros, and these are abbreviated bios. I apologize, but if you want to know more, Google them. That's all I can say. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom, a distinguished visiting fellow in Middle Eastern Studies at the Hoover Institution, professorial lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, School of Advanced International Studies, co-host of a great show on Al Hura, Sam and Omar. He's received his MA in Democracy and Governance from Georgetown and BA in Political Science from the American University in Cairo. Andy Zemenides is the Executive Director of the Hellenic American Leadership Council, where he oversees advocacy and public education initiatives on issues concerning U.S. interest in Southeastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Received his BA in Political Science from DePaul, an MA in Theory and Practice of Human Rights from the University of Essex, and a JD from Georgetown University. Aram Hamparian is the Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America, which is the, I'm sure everybody in this room knows, the largest and most influential Armenian American grassroots political organization. At Anka, Aram and his team work to promote the vision of a free, united, and independent Armenia, guide U.S. policy on matters of interest to the Armenian American community, and serve as liaison between that community and their elected officials. Last, but certainly not least, in some sense the boss of the panel, Rich Gazal, is the new Executive Director of In Defense of Christians, having just retired after an illustrious career as a U.S. Air Force JAG officer, where he served as a legal advisor to the Secretary of the Air Force, federal prosecutor, and special assistant U.S. attorney. Before that, as an intelligence officer, as the chief of Levant political military intelligence for the U.S. Air Force in Europe. He received his BA in political science and philosophy from Rhode Island College, an MA in organizational leadership from Regent University, and a JD from New England School of Law. He's also a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Air Force Intelligence Officer School, and if that's not enough, he's also an ordained reader in the Syriac Orthodox Church and speaks fluent Turoyo, which I find extremely interesting. What's also interesting is the spectrum that's represented on this panel. You have Syriac Orthodox, Armenian, Greek, and Coptic. I don't know if they planned it that way, but it's actually perfect, right? It's like touching every part of it. Also interesting with respect to this panel is the fact that we're talking about religious freedom in several different contexts, and I think it's important to note this at the front end, and I'll pass it over. Sam, who's going to be speaking first, is speaking about religious freedom in the Gulf, in Egypt, in Muslim-majority states. Aram and Andy are going to be talking about religious freedom that concerns two sovereign states, where the majority is not Muslim, but in fact Christian. Different, very different context. And Rich, I don't know what to call Lebanon and investment. It's like something in between. The presence of Christians in Lebanon is very big and strong, but it's also not quite a sovereign state. So I think it's what he'll have to say is very interesting. But to kick us off, Samuel Tadros, focusing on Egypt and the Gulf states. Sam, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction and for organizing this panel. It's always a challenge to go first, especially with such a distinguished panel. So in a sense, I have to kick off the conversation by laying the problem that we're dealing with. And the fact that it is a problem is, of course, indisputable, as it is one that involves a debate that goes on in the US every year, every time we have elections for God knows how many years. The question of how do we balance between our interests around the world, and that those obviously include defense interests and relationship and alliances with various militaries of the Middle East, and between our values. But the problem is not just in that eternal debate between values and interests. It gets even more complicated when we look at the Middle East for the fact that not all our values seem to be adopted at the same degree by those governments. Take the case of the United Arab Emirates, a country that has taken major steps in terms of promoting toleration and religious freedom, not just inside that country, but also across the region. At the same time, a country that does not have a democratic system of government, that does not believe in press freedom or any of the other freedoms that we believe in. So not just how do we balance between interests and between our values, but how to deal with these complex situations when our values are adopted with various degrees by these governments. Or take the case of Egypt, an important ally to the United States. We've had a continuous relationship with the Egyptian military since the late 70s. The US provides over $1.3 billion to Egypt every year in terms of military aid, outside of any economic aid that it receives. And the Egyptian military is obviously a key player, if not the main player, in that country's future. And yet, despite this close relationship, Egypt remains a country where Copts face various forms of discrimination and persecution. Despite passing a law that supposedly would make the recognition of existing churches in Egypt easier, in 2016, late 2016, until today, 5 years after, we still have over 2/3 of the churches in Egypt not recognized by the government, despite submitting their applications for that. When Copts are attacked in the country, the Egyptian government does not punish those that attack them. It does not seek to implement the law and offer equality to all of its citizens. Instead, they arrest an equal number of the Coptic victims and those attacking them in order to force both communities to sit together and solve the matter. Those reconciliation sessions, which become, in a sense, create a culture of impunity for anyone to attack the Copts, as well as a culture of encouragement. You get to attack the Copts. Those sessions sponsored by the government allow you then to enforce your own demands on them, to force them to accept them, and you're going to get away with it. So why not? So how do we deal with those situations? And more importantly, how do we balance between, in a sense, the carrot and the stick, between punishing regimes or militaries because of the behavior that they do and the responsibilities or their responsibility for acts of discrimination and persecution of religious minorities, as well as attempting to encourage them to play a positive role? I think the debate in a large sense has always been about the stick. Such regime, the Saudi regime, for example, kills Gamal Khashoggi, so we need to punish Saudi Arabia. I think, on the other hand, we haven't provided or we haven't developed or spent a lot of time thinking about how we can use the existing alliances in order to further religious freedom in those countries. Let me give an example. To the US every year comes thousands, tens of thousands of military officers from all around the world. Those are members of the militaries that we are allies with. Most of them are low-ranking officers that come to attend various trainings on US weapons that they use in their countries. But they also include high-ranking officers who come to attend the Naval Academy, the various US Army colleges, in order to receive master's or PhD degrees in various military sciences and arts. Throughout those trainings that those people receive, nothing is done, in a sense, to introduce them to America or American values. And these are not just random officers that will retire from their militaries in a few years. Just to cite one relevant example, President Sisi of Egypt was a student in the US Army College back in 2004. The Chief of Staff of the Egyptian military was similarly a student at that Army College in 2005. These are people that are going to lead their countries. If we are to engage with those militaries, Should religious freedom and putting values and emphasizing values of toleration, shouldn't these be part of the conversation that we're having with them? We're getting them when they're still at their mid-level career and before they completely form their opinions about their own countries and about the world. Shouldn't we be emphasizing those values in that relationship? More importantly, as the U.S. military, the U.S. military stands against discrimination of any form or shape. Well, it is no coincidence that when we get those students from Egypt, they happen to exclude a certain segment of Egyptian society, i.e. the religious minorities. Looking at the records, and I have looked at these records of various officers that come to the U.S. to study in the Army colleges, the religious minorities, Scots, are completely excluded from these. Shouldn't, in our conversation with the Egyptian military, the idea of inclusion of minority officers be part of that conversation? It shouldn't, or it doesn't have to be in a formal fashion of we request a certain quota of officers being Christians. No, but it can come in the form of comments. We notice there are no Copts amongst you. Is that the case in your country? Aren't Copts about 10% of your population? Why don't they get to be also officers in your military in high-ranking positions? So what I'm trying to emphasize here, and I guess my time will soon be up, is that in this complex conversation about militaries and religious freedom, while the two fields seem completely detached from each other, there is a large room for us to bring the conversation about religious freedom into our relationship with those militaries. And it doesn't have to be just using the stick, although sometimes that has to be used. There are certain cases where we would need to draw the line and emphasize that US weapons, for example, should not be used in repression of these minorities or repression of any segment of the population in general. There are areas where we can cut aid or threaten to cut aids in various situations and countries. And all of these should be part of the conversation. But we should also think about how to utilize this relationship with those military institutions, because at the end of the day, those militaries, in a large extent, run their countries. Just as it was once said about the Prussian army that it has a state and not the reverse, the case or the similar situation is that of Egypt, of Algeria, of many of the countries in the region where the militaries play such an important role. And if anyone doubts the importance of these, the role that they can play, let us remember that before the United States of America elected an African American president, it first accepted having an African American chief of staff, joint chiefs of staff. It is those militaries as forms of integration in their countries that we should be thinking of as we deal with that question of religious freedom and military policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting, and in a lot of ways what you're saying is very simple and obvious, but I don't think it's anything that anyone's really working on in a consistent way. Andy, I'd love to hear from you about Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus.
So I could go on and on. You know, Greeks are very shy, but I'm going to try to reserve most of my time for discussion. You know, we're talking about allies, antagonists, and arms sales. We should focus on allies that are really antagonists. I will talk about Turkey. I'm sure I will get into Azerbaijan. But Sam brought up the balance between values and interests. And it makes me think of Ben Franklin's famous quote, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." For years, even though our essential liberty, we are in a country that was founded on religious freedom. It's literally the first freedom. But when it has come to security interests and realism and arms sales, we ignore that religious freedom. We ignore the rights of those religious minorities. We ignore the fate of Christians in Artsakh, in Armenia, in Egypt, in Cyprus. And at the end, it's our very weapons that are used against those minorities. Cyprus, Maronite churches. Bishop, you're there, right? Not only Greek churches, Maronite churches, Greek churches, the St. Andrew Monastery, the site where the first Christian mission in the Bible was in Cyprus. He's being occupied today with American arms. Churches were bombed, Christian minorities were bombed in Artsakh. Look at those drones. I can talk about it. They have at least 10 American components in them. So tell me where our values are served by that. But it's not only our values, it's our interests. Right? What do we say about religious minorities? Religious freedom, they're the canary in the coal mine. Right? And we don't pay attention. When somebody uses our arms to oppress religious minorities, they will eventually oppose us, oppose American interests. That's what's happening. The American arms that are used to occupy Cyprus, they're also used to bully lesser energy companies that may be drilling for gas in the Eastern Mediterranean. They are also being stationed in occupied Cyprus. You're having anti-access area denial weapons. Who are those aimed at? They're not aimed at the Greeks, they're there. They're not aimed at Israel, they're there. So that's aimed against the American Navy. So when we compromise on our values, we will compromise on our interests. I can give you more details in the Q&A because the bill of indictment and details I can get to is long. But we have to keep that balance in mind because the balance has always been let's sacrifice the values to safeguard the interests. And for people who want to do a little more reading, there's a great contrast. Compare last decade's report by the Council on Foreign Relations on U.S.-Turkey, which Turkey was a golden child. The Armenian lobby in Greece and Cyprus, they were the bad guys for keeping Turkey from being in the EU. Same author, 10 years later, authored a report saying neither friend nor foe, saying Turkey not only doesn't share our values, it doesn't share our fundamental interests. A year after he did that report, he did a podcast with us, where he said, I would retitle it more foe than friend. That's what we should be thinking about.
Thank you, Indy. I want to turn from the Eastern Mediterranean to Armenia, Artsakh, and talk about that. Aram Berry, please.
Thank you very much, Robert. You hold a very, very special place in our heart during some of the darkest days of Azerbaijan's war against Artsakh. You and the Philos Project stood up when many would not to defend the indigenous Armenian population of Artsakh, and that will not be forgotten ever. Another word of praise for Robert is that he and the Philos Project have very, very significantly upgraded the conversation on religious freedom from, I would say, we talked about this yesterday, from like checkers to chess, from moving beyond some of the false choices of interests and values. I would say focusing more on the how and less on the should, and I think that's a tremendous contribution. And then the success of the Philos Project, I think, is going to be a very, very good thing for America and the world. That's number one. Number two, a big thank you to Tufik and his team at In Defense of Christians. I've said this before, believe it from the bottom of my heart, that IDC, In Defense of Christians, is truly America's response to a century or more of indifference to the plight of religious minorities, persecuted Christians, and others around the world, and a great service to our nation. Thank you. I want to recognize Brian, my Armenian colleague and very dear friend. Also, Robert Avedisian, who represents very capably the Republic of Artsakh here in Washington, D.C., a brave and courageous representative of that very brave and courageous nation. There's more, there's a lot of you I know, so if I went around the room, I could probably say wonderful things about each of you. But I want to jump right in. Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. The COVID pandemic kind of bookended my visits there. Right, like about a week before the virus kind of like froze things, I had a chance to visit, and then I just got back about a week ago from Artsakh. The last time I was able to visit Dadivank, which is a Vank in Armenian means monastery. Dadi was a student of St. Thaddeus, who in the 1st century helped establish that as a cultural and religious center for the Armenians. Today, this past week, I was not able to attend the church to light a candle to say a prayer because it's under the control of the Azerbaijani military. That is the result of a war that Baku launched in September of last year. From an Armenian perspective, I think from a historical perspective, it was very much a continuation of what the Turks began in 1915. If you look at the map, if you study the history, you can see that Armenia, as the indigenous Armenian homeland, has shrunk continually as a pan-Turkish drive seeks to essentially annihilate the Armenian nation. The Artsakh was the most recent victim, 75% of it lost in the last year, and the new target is Sunik or Zangezur, which is the southern part of Armenia. My family has deep roots there, and Azerbaijan has killed a soldier yesterday and is currently occupying portions of southern Armenia. The United States government sometimes will be slow to recognize this pan-Turkish drive, but the Turkish and Aussie leaders are very open about it. I think Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, spoke this week about the return of Yerevan, which is the capital of Armenia, Sunik, which is the south of Armenia, and the rest of Armenia to Turkish hands. So they make no secret of it. What to do about it? In our particular case, I think a good place to start would be, well, do no harm, right? The first question might be, what might the United States, what might U.S. policymakers, the West, and others do to constrain Azerbaijan and Turkey from this type of aggression against indigenous Christians in this part of the world? Okay, that's one question. A better, maybe more urgent question is, well, what are you doing, not to stop it, but what are you doing to encourage it? And the sad reality is, we're now $120 million into a U.S. military aid program to the very country that launched this aggression. And so maybe we could stop those funds. It's not simply that the money empowers the Azerbaijani military, although it surely does. But Azerbaijan's a rich country. $120 million is not going to be a game changer. What it does do, though, is signal to Baku that you're doing just fine. Business as usual. No problem here. Move along. That's a dangerous proposition. And it's happened over and over and over again. On the battlefield, Robert knows this very well. When Turkish drones were shot down, the drones that Turkey provided Azerbaijan, very advanced Bayraktar drones, when they were opened up on the battlefield, as you mentioned, they found at least 10 U.S. components, right? So do no harm is a good place to start. If Turkey decides to help Azerbaijan massacre Armenians, if they choose to commit war crimes, if they choose to launch white phosphorus against villagers, right? Let's make sure that white phosphorus is not sourced here in the U.S. Let's make sure those drones are not built with Garmin parts and Microtech parts and other U.S. technology. There is a lot more I could talk about. I'll also try to reserve some time for Q&A. Very encouraged that there's a project out of Cornell and Purdue universities. Brian is very familiar with this project, to document the Armenian churches and monasteries that are currently under Azerbaijani control. They've worked with satellite imagery, and they have really, I think, have a world-class, very high-tech operation to monitor literally, I think, over 200 individual sites and some of the most ancient Christian sites in that part of the world, perhaps in all the world. Also very encouraged that the Bible Museum will host they have an online exhibit currently, but next year they will host an in-person exhibit featuring the Christian heritage of Artsakh. These are important. They don't change what happened, but hopefully they can deter from things such as this from happening again. Azerbaijan continues to hold prisoners of war. A topic. It's incredibly painful. So many Armenian families I won't dig too deep into it here. I would say that in the spirit of do no harm, we would focus and do urge our government to stop all military aid to Azerbaijan. I think that's the first thing we can do. It's probably the most important thing we can do. Once that's done, we can then turn our attention to how we can restrain Azerbaijan. But let us stop first arming Azerbaijan. Thank you.
Again, last but not least, Rich, talking about Lebanon and the security situation there. Rich, please.
It's no easy task to follow this amazing panel. They're outstanding, so we'll give it our best shot. I'd like to also talk about the same issue, but from the flip side of the coin. You've heard about violators of religious freedom in the Middle East and how we continue to support their military adventures. I'd like to take a moment and focus on some success stories of religious freedom in the Middle East and the opportunities we can take to bolster these governments and these societies. That society I'm talking about, the country I'm talking about, is Lebanon. But more importantly, the enormous threat that they face currently, the existential threat to the Christian community in Lebanon, but also the Christian community in the greater Middle East, and how the U.S. can use its foreign policy as an instrument, particularly by military assistance and humanitarian assistance, to reverse this trend and preserve religious freedom in Lebanon and in the Middle East. Lebanon, as you probably know, is the last free bastion of Christianity in the Middle East. It has the highest per capita rate of Christians, at about 35 to 40% Christians, which is a very unique thing in the Middle East. A century ago, 20% of the entire population of the Middle East was Christian. Today, it's only 2%. Contrast that with Lebanon's 40%. But unless we act with intention and fast, that will quickly decline. Not only do they have the highest per capita rate of Christians in any country in the Middle East, but also they have a seat at the table. They have a position of power. The president is always a Maronite Catholic Christian. But today they face a tremendous challenge, an existential challenge. For about 2 years now, they've been in quick decline, teetering on failed state status, disaster. This problem is threefold, has three facets. First, of course, it's the financial crisis that we all see in the headlines of the news. Of course, we couple that with the political crisis. Ever since August of last year, we're approaching 1 year now, there's been no Lebanese government to speak of. And what is left of the Lebanese government is corrupt. They treat Lebanon as a for-profit business for their own profit at the expense of the Lebanese people. 60% of the Lebanese population is below the poverty line. The inflation has put people without food, without water, clothing, medicine. They can't even pay for a roof over their head. The runs on the banks make currency inaccessible completely, and what can be accessed or what can be kept under the mattress has lost 90% of its value. The crisis is real. The collapse of the state could come in weeks, possibly months, and that spells disaster for the Christian community in Lebanon and the greater region. But in addition to that is the humanitarian crisis. All these issues, the political issues, the financial issues, conflicts, create a humanitarian crisis. As I said, people are without food and medicine. Exacerbating all these crises is the national security crisis. For the last 4 decades, Lebanon has been infiltrated by a cancer, by a tumor. Over the last 4 decades, that tumor has metastasized from a terrorist organization into a terrorist army and a quasi-government within a state. I can't stand. That tumor, that cancer is called Hezbollah. We've all heard of it. They pitch themselves, they brand themselves as the sovereign state, as the guardian of Lebanese sovereignty. They've brought every mess that's come to Lebanon over the last 40 years has been brought by Hezbollah or through Hezbollah's fingerprints, with Iran backing them. The problems are many. In order to face these problems and address these problems, they must be triaged. First and foremost, the humanitarian crisis. As I said, it comes with food, water, below the poverty line. But in addition to that, the United States must come to the Lebanese aid by supporting Lebanese institutions, civil society institutions outside of the government. We're talking about Christian schools, hospitals, and other institutions. Not uniquely because they are Christian, although they are, but because they provide objectively the highest quality of education and healthcare in the nation. That benefits Christians, but also Muslims, Shiites, Sunnis, Druze, and all other religious communities in Lebanon. It's a unifying factor in the Lebanese society. Right now we see Lebanon falling apart, as we saw in the 70s and 80s, with each faction taking its corner. It's civil society, uniquely Christian civil society, schools and hospitals that bring them together, that offer a backbone, a unifying identity to Lebanese. In the midst of the madness and the dire circumstances in Lebanon, one voice has come to the forefront that has displayed wisdom, foresight, and that's the voice of the Maronite Catholic Patriarch, Cardinal Rai. He's come forward and said, Lebanon will not continue as a unified state unless we proceed with neutrality, but not just neutrality, active neutrality. We will look out for Lebanese interests and none other, not Iranian, not Saudi, certainly not Turkish. In recent days, we see a burgeoning threat also in Lebanon. The Patriarch has proposed a UN conference spearheaded by the United States and France, who have unique interests, both the United States and France, in Lebanon. France has a long history in Lebanon. In fact, they played a critical role in founding Lebanon in 1920. Its raison d'etre, Lebanon's reason for being, was to be a home, a bastion of religious pluralism, and that's exactly the role it served for the last 101 years. So a unique interest lies in France. The United States, similarly. The United States' first military engagement in the Middle East ever was in Lebanon in 1958. And arguably, I would certainly say, it's been the only undeniable and unarguable success in the Middle East that the United States has embarked upon in Lebanon. So the United States certainly has an interest as well. But this idea of neutrality is not just a magic word, it's not just a magic theory that can come into existence just by willing it into existence, of course. It can only be secured by a credible deterrent, a military deterrent within its borders, a sovereign military force, and that is the Lebanese Armed Forces. Right now, the Lebanese Armed Forces is gutted in training, in materiel, that is to say, weapons of war, but also in personnel. The current financial crisis has not left the military rank and file unaffected. They can't pay their wages, they can't live. If you have soldiers who can't live, forget their families, but even pay for themselves, you have no army, and that's the case today. The only way the Lebanese Armed Forces can become a credible deterrent force within Lebanon to displace and replace Hezbollah is by providing assistance from the West, the very subject we're talking about today. Let's not forget the variables, Iran, China, and even Turkey. They are more than happy and eager and ready tomorrow to come to Lebanese aid, both in terms of humanitarianism as well as the political issues, financial issues. But the question the United States needs to ask itself is, do we want that to happen? The Lebanese don't want that to happen, but when you're hungry, what other option do you have? The Chinese are more than ready to come in with Iran. This is what the United States needs to keep in mind. It's a tug of war in Lebanon. It's a small state, as Bashir Shmani said some 40 years ago. It's a small state. It's easily swallowed, but it's impossible to digest. And that's what the United States needs to realize. Lebanon is not a lost cause, but we can't lose sight of the problems there and our role, our critical role that we can play in serving the Lebanese state. So once again, triage. First and foremost, humanitarianism. Second is the political crisis, providing political will to the leaders to come to the table, to put together a responsible, credible, technocratic government. And finally, the national security question. Hezbollah must be displaced and replaced for Lebanon to continue as the final and continuing bastion of Christianity in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. I'm going to use my prerogative as a moderator to change our format. We're going to bounce around and talk to each other, but we don't want to hear ourselves. We want to hear you. And I see a lot of experts. I see people who actually have been in the defense space and in the military space. I'm sure there are lots of thoughts. So only a few requests from you. Say your name, where you're from. Keep it succinct and keep it related to that title on the screen, okay? We're going to try to, there's a lot to talk about. We've got to keep it tight, okay? Questions? Yes, ma'am, please. There's a microphone coming your way. Honorable Stephen Howard, right there at the back.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everything and these leaders. As you guys know, because a lot of these problems are somewhat connected to Iran. And I would like to know how the United States is planning to deal with Iran, because they have their hands spread out in many countries. And they're dealing with, how is it that you're planning to deal with that? Thank you.
Rich, I guess maybe we'll start with you, probably most relevant for Lebanon.
That's a great question, Colonel. Thank you. So Iran is an issue. Iran has been an issue for 40 years now, over 40 years now. Their tentacles are spread throughout the region and throughout the world for that matter. And it's a problem. They're causing problems in Iraq, certainly in Lebanon, as I just addressed, and they're spreading to Africa and other places. They're opportunists. And their mission is not political, it's religious. It's to expand the revolution, the Iranian revolution, of course. The United States is in a unique juncture right now for foreign policy. We read a lot about the Iran deal, right? The resurrection of the Iran deal. But we hear conditions thrown around and discussed as ideas going forward, or should we go forward. But really, the sticking point for us at IDC and then what we've been pushing hard with in the U.S. government is the proxy militias and the proxy operations that Iran sponsors must be dismantled. Now, whether or not Iran would go for an idea like that, I have doubts, but that should be a condition that the United States places. And if Iran can agree to this very small ask, for them it's a big ask, but it's a simple ask. If you want this Iran deal to go through, this is what you need to agree to. We can't be willing to move on that. We can't be willing to budge on that. And too often, U.S. policy is more expedient than it is principled, I would say, unfortunately. But that really it's a black and white issue because they're causing more havoc in the region and in the world than any other government that I can think of. We call out a lot of violators of religious freedom. I can name 3, and Iran is always going to be in the top 3. So the United States needs to go forward with a clear-throated approach and not move from that.
Good. Next question. All the way in the back, yes.
Thanks, Andre, and thank you all for your valuable insight. I have a question regarding a theme that appears consistent through all of your remarks, and that is that religious freedom issues are almost always at the periphery of U.S. foreign policy. So my question is, why is that? Would placing religious freedom issues at the top of our priority list almost clash with our defense goals? And if so, can you reconcile that?
Religious freedom, it's central to the United States, but it seems peripheral in our foreign policy. What can be done about that? Are there things being done about that?
It's a really good question. Requires probably a really long response. Just to be very practical about it. Think about what it takes to become a decision maker in, let's say, the U.S. foreign policy space, defense space, and what type of attributes of that would you have? What kind of compromises would you be willing to make? I don't doubt that there's I do not doubt that there's plenty of newly minted foreign service officers and officers, military officers who are a bit idealistic and stuff. I don't think they get promoted a whole lot, and probably by the time you do the up and out thing, you're dealing with a bunch of 40-somethings who are pretty hard-nosed and cynical about the world. So it's just maybe just part of the way our system is hardwired, that you're not going to have a lot of, I would say, idealistic risk takers or visionary people at sort of the top of the pyramid. And by visionary, I mean this, right? On any given day, the easy solution is to say, well, 3 months out, 6 months out, here's the smart move to make, and it's going to be more interest-based, right? But if you're thinking not in terms of like months, but years, or even decades, you might say, well, our interest in the Middle East will be well served by a diverse Middle East. That is something that you might think if you were thinking about not just the next quarter, but the next quarter century. So there's a bunch of, I think, institutional reasons why religious freedom and human rights tend to be very low on the list. People say they're not on the list. They are on the list. They're just really, really low on the list. And so, like, when there's a scene center memo that gets sent out to some assistant secretary who's going to go meet with the leader of Egypt or wherever, rest assured, human rights and religious freedom, they're on the list. Definitely on the list. They're just really, really maybe page 6 of the list, and they're given to the 22-year-old attaché to look at, and then when the actual principals sit down, it never comes up. And only very rarely. Where it does come up, and again, this is me as a sort of cynical, here's some cynical grumbling, it will come up when it's convenient, right? It will come up when it's convenient. So human rights, democracy, religious freedom, very often get pulled out of the toolbox when they're convenient. So, country A is on the good list. We don't use those tools. Country B is on the not so good list. You use some of them, and the country C is on the devils. You fire away with all the tools in your arsenal, and that creates obviously double or triple standards, which undermines our credibility. And so there's a lot of reasons why, but you're definitely right that it's not a driving principle of our international engagement.
I want to add, it's because, this is to the credit of Independence of Christians, and the Summit organizers, and the People's Project. These coalitions that we witnessed these last couple of days they didn't exist years ago. And Aram can tell you that when he helped put together a coalition, and I remember the call, hey, can you call these guys again on the vote for that Indian genocide resolution? And IDC and Philos were doing. If somebody, and I'm forgetting, and excuse me if you're here, but there was a great presentation yesterday in the plenary that says we're all here talking about our own cause and urges, and we're very loud about our own cause. But real progress, the symphony is when all the oppressed speak together, right? And we haven't done that. Sam could tell you that USERP has been doing great work calling things out, and then it gets to the State Department level, the State Department just ignored USERP for years. And nobody said anything. Maybe the Armenians would say, well, this is our issue got ignored, and the Greeks would say our issue got ignored, and the Maronites our issue got ignored. And we didn't say, you ignored all of them, because all of them were ignored. And so I think if we're going to make them central, we all have to speak, and principally too, because, it's too much. There have been among groups, there's been too much apathy. And, I see, my friend Steve O'Shaughnessy from a Demand of Action, how we, he made the case and we rallied and we mobilized for Christians in Iraq against ISIS. And that was a real wake-up moment. That was something that we all went through the same thing. The Armenian genocide, there was a Greek genocide that happened at the same time. And if we don't all speak up, it's going to be like that famous World War II quote, right? First it came from the socialists, I didn't speak because I wasn't socialist. Then they came from the communists, and they came from the Jews. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak. We have to be that symphony and speak all together.
I'm always impressed by Andy. You're reminding me what I forgot to say. And it's very simple. So go back to what I mentioned about Robert. If the question is, what should we do? What should America do? That's like, I don't know that gets us where we should go. Because it's kind of, we all have an idea what should happen, right? It just should is a very powerful idea. How is like a powerful idea. And I think that IDC and Philos and others and all of us up here have focused on the how. And once you focus on the how, you can start getting things done. But it's not the moral appeal. It's not the appeal to conscience. It's much more than that. That's the checkers version. It's fun, play checkers. But if you want to win the game, you got to play chess.
Sure. There are obviously reasons related to the United States itself. There's something to be said about how religious freedom is a partisan issue, or it's used in the partisan divide in the U.S. So there are millions of things, I think, related to the U.S., but let me focus on one thing related to the Middle East specifically. I think there's something wrong in the way we teach and look at the Middle East. Meaning, if you go to any U.S. university, you're offering courses about the Middle East, and you take any of the introductory courses about Arab thought, Arab politics, whatever it is, you end up with an image and a coursework about the region that focuses on what is deemed the majority population. Meaning that the Middle East is viewed as an Arab, Sunni, Muslim region. And that approach, I think, impacts our foreign policy towards it, because you want to you don't deal with every small minority in every country in the world. You want to deal with the majority, the ones that can impact policy and decide things. And that's a serious problem. It's true that the Christian presence in the Middle East today has declined dramatically from what it was. But if you go beyond the Christians and go beyond just the religious, you end up seeing the region as something completely different, as a region that doesn't actually have one majority, because the Nazir of North Africa are going to tell you, we're not Arabs. And the Kurds are going to tell you, we're not Arabs. And you're going to get the Sunni Shia divide, and the Ibadis in Oman, and all these divisions and groups, this mosaic of minorities. Once you get to see that, whether it's in the US decision making, or even in the way that we teach it in US university, I think that would change the way you formulate policy towards this region in the first place.
An excellent point. We're running low on time, but I want to have one more quick question. Dr. Habib Malik, please.
Thank you. Habib Malik from Lebanon. My question is basically to Andy and maybe around everybody else as well. And it focuses on one of the many elephants in the room in the Middle East space, and that is Turkey. Now, this is a difficult question. I'm sure nobody really has the answer, but let's try to chart a little bit about the how. Turkey is a member of NATO. Yet, one or both of you alluded to the fact that Turkey is not necessarily a friend of the United States on many levels. So what to do about Turkey? Damned if you leave them inside, damned if you let them go. What? Any thinking along those lines? Thank you.
Question was on the how of Turkey. Turkey's the elephant in the room. It's been mentioned several times. There's a dilemma. Do you keep them close? Do you push them out? Andy and Ara, we have only a couple minutes.
It's actually surprisingly easier than we're making it out to be. Because for decades, and we've heard this, we get promises of pushback, but they say we have to do it quietly. We have to do it quietly because the Turks don't react well to public pressure. We've learned over the last 4 years that's actually the only thing they react to. Right? And this is not, neither one of us goes to Congress and say, throw them out of NATO, which you can't, by the way, take down the government, none of that. But we have to be honest, and it's not only, they're not the only problem country in NATO. Hungary is a problem country, right? But when you see someone who is, you're supposedly a democracy, this was an EU that still aspires to be an EU candidate state. You call things out. You call things out. And finally, as we said, when they violated our values, they eventually violated our interests. And then we woke up and put caps of sanctions because they were buying S-400s. And by the way, the components that Adam referred to in the drones, if those components are still being shipped to Turkey, those are a violation of U.S. law too. So we, at a minimum, should be asking the administration to tell us, are those components still being shipped? Because Canada, who also have a few components, stopped export licenses to Turkey. I think if we're honest with Turkey, say, you want to be an ally? That's fine. These are the standards of an ally. Everybody else gets pressured. Everybody else gets pressured. Greece got pressured. Reduce your, when the Syriza government was in, says, reduce, you want American help? Reduce your relationship with Russia. All their Baltics got it too. Same thing. Let's just be honest and see where they go. But I'm afraid that we have been giving mixed signals to Turkey for decades, and we just have to end that bad habit. No mixed signals, and be very open and honest.
I would agree with Andy. And, okay, 30 seconds. The United States and Turkey have a long-standing alliance. Turkey decided some years ago to walk away from that alliance. The U.S. government was slow to recognize that shift and operated on the assumption of the alliance, which means deference and deference and sort of excessive concern about sensitivities of opera. The U.S. needs to wake up to that fact and say, okay, you're treating us now in a sweet fashion.
we will respond in kind. We have today a much more reciprocal transactional relationship than what would be normally considered in the line.
These are really, we're all friends up here, but truly some of the most, the best practitioners of this work. And I would urge you, if you have time afterward on the break, to come up and speak to them individually about these countries and these issues. In the meantime, please join me in thanking them for taking time for this. Thank you all for coming. Intervention Christians, please follow us on social media. Please stay up to date with our work. There's several staff members up here in the front. I'd urge you to talk to them as well. Thank you.